Good morning, everyone. My name is Evan. I'm one of the ministers at St Mary's Anglican Church, and today for Psalm a Day, we're looking at Psalm 60. So if you haven't read the psalm yet, I encourage you to do that now, because I'm not going to read it myself. I'm actually just going to focus on one particular bit. So Psalm 60 is a lament, it's a cry to God, and the psalmist is asking God to come back to his people, to come back to Judah and to Israel, and to save them from their enemies. But there's one particular bit that I want to focus on today, and that is verses 6 through 8. The reason why I want to focus on these is because there's a lot of historical sort of context things that if we don't kind of go through, we won't really understand what the psalmist is saying. Now, usually when it comes to psalms, they're deliberately made to be historically ambiguous. Sorry, there's a lot of words, but what I mean by that is a lot of the detail is taken out of it, so that an Israelite maybe 200 years after this psalm is reading it can say, oh yes, no, this relates to how I'm living right now, what I'm feeling, I can pray it too. And even 2,500 years later, a Christian can read through the Spirit, understanding what Jesus has done for them, and say, actually, yes, this relates to how my life under God and in a broken world is in the moment. And sometimes the detail is left in because there's particular imagery that comes to mind when we talk about particular places. What's an example? If I say Queensland, you think, or I wonder if you think the same. You think beaches, right? Beaches and Gold Coast and that sort of stuff. If I say Victoria, you might think of Melbourne, you might think of cold, you might think of inferior to Sydney. Sorry. What else? If I say, we take it a step further, sometimes there are cultural memories and there are feelings brought up by mentioning particular places. Now, as a nation, we don't really have many of these, and I think it's quite good that we don't. However, if I say Port Arthur, for a lot of us who are alive when the massacre happened, we think of that, we are reminded of that. Thinking a bit more recently, if I say Lynn Cafe in Martin Place, a lot of people are taken back to the events that happened there just a few years ago. And so when we look at when I say these names here that are in the psalm, the psalmist deliberately wants us to think of particular things. And now I'm not, but the problem is I'm not a Jew who lived through these times and have these cultural memories. And so I need assistance going back. And so to do that, I've brought on a commentary to help me. Being a Psalms man, I have a couple of Psalms commentaries, but the one that I've gone for today is quite an in-depth commentary from H.C. Leupold. And I'm just gonna go through and cherry pick some things which will help us understand. So I'll just read the section first, and then I'll go back and look at the names in particular. God has spoken from his sanctuary. In triumph I will pass about Shechem and measure off the valley of Succoth. In Gilead is mine, and Manasseh is mine. Ephraim is my helmet, Judah my scepter. Moab is my wash basin. Upon Edom I toss my sandal, over Philistia I shout in triumph. Okay, so let's have a look at some of those names. The first one is Shechem and the Valley of Succoth. So that's actually, it's a place, and the valley is, of course, between two places. Okay, why is this important? Well, so Shechem was a place where Jacob stayed after his return from Mesopotamia in Genesis 33. And Succoth is his, when he crossed the Jordan, his place of stopping prior to stopping in Shechem in Genesis 33. And so these places represent west and east of the Jordan, respectively, the Jordan River. And so what God is saying is that he will measure them out and he will give them to his people. Okay, so the next two names, Gilead and Manasseh. So Gilead and Manasseh are parts of the promised land which were promised to certain tribes. And God here is staking a claim over these things. By the way, all this land is up north. So it's in military way of speaking, it's the hardest part of the land to defend. Down low is where all the fortresses are, down in Judah. But up top is all farming land and such. And that's where all the other dangerous nations are. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, they're all up around top. So it's the hardest part for them to defend. But God stakes a claim over Gilead and Manasseh. And so what God is doing at this point is staking claim over lands on both the east and west side of the Jordan. Okay. The next two set of names, Ephraim is my helmet and Judah is my scepter. And so here, Ephraim and Judah are the two most powerful cities in the land of Israel. And the metaphors that are chosen to represent them, a helmet and a scepter, the helmet, of course, is of military might, and the scepter is of ruling might, or even could be a heavy, blunt weapon. But I think more in this sense, it's a ceremonial weapon. And so perhaps his power is in Ephraim and he rules from Judah. And so he's claiming these cities as belonging to him. His people are safe in them. The last three names, Moab, Edom, and Philistia, they are enemies of Israel. It sounds a bit funny, but these are all insults to the nations. And so Moab, let me find a bit here. Moab is given the quite inferior position of being Israel's wash basin, and it's not hand washing, it's feet washing. So God and God's people, perhaps maybe the king of Israel, will wash his feet in Moab. It's a good insult. I'm sure Monty Python could have had that on one of their shows. Okay, next, Edom. Edom, what does this one say? I will toss my sandal. And this action is almost, returning from a day and then throwing your shoes to your slave to clean off your shoes. So Edom is another enemy of Israel. And so the imagery here is Edom being subject to Israel and being in slavery to Israel. Finally, Philistia, which is a real internal threat to Israel. Remember, they just lived on the slither of coast between Israel and the sea. And they were always a formidable enemy, particularly in the early days of Israel and Judah. Of Israel, because they had quite decent technological advancements over Israel. But here, God shouts in triumph over Philistia, and so they've been beaten. I have won. I've done it. What's it? I don't know. A common victory cry. So I want to talk about sports analogies, and I want to talk about people singing sports songs. And maybe it'll work. But the problem is, in football, in real football, soccer football, fans sing whether you win or lose. So that's not really helpful. But AFL is a good example of fans only singing when they win. And so when you go to an AFL game, and the victory song is played at the end of the game, it's only played if they've won. And the fans only sing along if they've won. And here, God shouts over Philistia. He sings over Philistia because he's won. Because he has beaten it. And those are God's enemies and Israel's enemies beaten there. Sometimes... So that's that section. Sometimes it is really helpful to grab out a commentary if you feel that perhaps what's happening in the text is a bit beyond beyond you, particularly for context sort of things. But this is only helpful if we can actually drive it to a meaning for us now. So in this section, God is declaring his people and the land promised to Abraham to be his, and that land to still belong to his people. And he also declares victory over his enemies, whilst proclaiming that the cities and the capital cities which his people live are still important to him and essential for him. For us, well, God has proclaimed victory for us, hasn't he? We have victory. What does Paul say in Romans 8? That nothing can keep us from the love of God. That Jesus has won the victory on the cross. And we have things that are waiting for us, things promised to us. A new promised land, better than that strip of land in the Middle East. A new perfect world waiting for us. That's the cry of victory that God has for us. Now, the Israelites, when they read this and they hear God making these cries, they don't walk away. They certainly don't ignore. No, they turn and they say, how awesome is God? And so we should do the same. Have you turned? Have you seen what God has done for you and what God has won for you? Have you seen him defeat his enemies for your freedom? And have you seen what you have to look forward to? God has victory. And verse 12, just to finish off, we will gain the victory and he will trample our enemies down. That is true. Through Christ, we have victory. Grace and peace to you.